Great to have you with us. In the Gulf's biggest diplomatic crisis in years, Saudi Arabia and its allies have cut off diplomatic ties with Qatar in an escalating power struggle in the Middle East. How will the rift endanger the region's political balance and hinder global efforts to fight terrorism? And as hundreds of experts and major space agencies gather in Beijing for the Global Space Exploration Conference, how will progress in space science and technology benefit people around the world in future? Welcome to The Point. I'm Li Qiuyuan sitting in for Liu Xin. Well, the second Global Space Exploration Conference, or GLEX 2017, is being held in Beijing from June 5th to 9th, following the first one in Washington 5 years ago. Emphasis of this conference is on deep space exploration, including future cooperation on further exploring the Moon, Mars, and asteroid. And with the theme of sharing and cooperation, this conference has attracted international experts and major space agencies from across the world. Where will the joint efforts lead to space exploration? To find out more, I'm now joined in the studio by Dr. Christian Fechtinger, Executive Director of the International Astronautic Federation, and also Mr. Roberto Battistin. He's the President of the Italian Space Agency. Thank you so much to you both for joining us. Let me start with Mr. Fechtinger first. Why has China been chosen to host this year's global conference? Is that a sign that China's recent development in the field has captured global attention?
Well, certainly it is a sign, but I need to say that China, through its Chinese Society of Astronautics and also the Chinese Association of Science and Technology Cooperation, is a very strong member in our federation. Our federation has the motto to connect space people. So we want to bring people who are active in space together. And certainly China has shown in the last years, with the strong support of the Chinese government and organizations like the China National Space Administration, that exploration is a very important topic for China and has made tremendous achievements and has become a major player in the space exploration. So that's for sure one of the main reasons why Beijing has been chosen as a location for this conference.
What are the qualities you guys looking for when you choose a host country, though? What are the standards?
Well, first of all, a country or organizations from this country should be active in our federation, and China is one of the most active actors in our federation. And of course, the development in a certain space sector in the country is a very important argument why you would go into to such a country. And it's not just by default that after the first Global Space Exploration Conference, which took place in 2012 in Washington, D.C., the second one is now here in Beijing to follow up 5 years after.
And Mr. Battistin, let me bring you in also. Why is the focus of this conference the deep space exploration?
Deep space is the next step in exploration, human exploration in particular. After the completion of the ISS, which is expected to be in the mid-20s, we have to anticipate additional steps. I mean, both destination, Moon or versus Mars, but also technologies, type of habitation, location. So this type of decision takes a long time and require a global cooperation, especially the next step, because there are very ambitious ones. Imagine, for instance, to bring a man to Mars, what it takes. I mean, it is typically something that can be successful is all the major space agencies of the major countries, China among them, find a way to do it together.
And we've also noticed that there is a subsession this year focusing on African space nations. Talk to us more about African nations' role in space exploration globally.
Well, we are very happy to have this interesting plenary tomorrow, and we will hear more tomorrow from space leaders from Africa, also how they see the involvement of emerging space countries into the global space exploration endeavor. But one of the major elements here, I think, is inspiration. We need to inspire our young generation, we need to inspire people, and there is nothing more exciting than spaceflight and exploration of space. So I think the element of the inspiration is very important here. But not only that, I think exploration and spaceflight in general also is a technology driver, and technology is necessary not only for developed and spacefaring nations, but certainly and specifically also for emerging countries.
Now, the theme of this conference is also sharing and cooperation. What can this conference bring about to those relatively undeveloped countries?
Well, it's all about networking. Bring together leaders of space nations and emerging space countries. Let them discuss, let them share their plans, and let them discuss and set up future cooperation. That is the motto of the International Astronautical Federation. That's what we are doing, connecting all space people.
Now, Mr. Battiston, Chang'e lunar probe of China, Chang'e 5 lunar probe, is a quite significant one of China's space calendar for this year. But what significance will it be if it's successfully launched, if it to bring China's space program? How will this progress benefit other countries?
I mean, the China program for the moon has been very impressive. First orbiting around the moon, then landing on the moon, then preparing for the sample return. All of that show that the technology is improving, the reliability is also improving, and also the science is increasing. And clearly, this is not about the moon only, because this kind of tools can be adapted to the planets or even to asteroids. So it's a preparation for more ambitious goals. So I think it's an increase in a stepwise function, which is very beneficial to China, of course, but also to prepare for international collaboration.
And there is cooperation between China and Italy, right? The China Manned Space Agency and the Italian Space Agency signed an agreement on cooperative human spaceflight activities in February, I should say, this year. What progress have been made so far on this one?
China has opening up the participation to its program, in particular to the manned space program, which is a very important one. After the signature, which was done during the visit of our President Mattarella to China, we had a number of meetings among the agencies, and now we are discussing more details among the engineers to find out which is the best way to make use of this very important.
And besides the moon, Mars is also becoming this popular destination, for sci-fi movies. And China is apparently planning to land on Mars by the year 2021. But to achieve that goal, what more cooperation globally is needed?
Well, I think there's hardly anybody in the space community today who is challenging that big things can only be achieved in space if you work together. Not individually as nations, but really as a community, a global community. The exploration of Mars is certainly something that is extremely difficult and extremely challenging, and only to put all the brightest minds of this world together and also the financial resources of different nations put together, we can achieve that really. And well, I hope we will see that in the next decades to come.
And at this year's conference, the Chinese president has emphasized the point of peaceful exploration, international coordination. But how important do you think this is at the stage of the play right now?
This is an essential point. The utilization of space can be only peaceful, because space is a very fragile environment. It's a very powerful one because it provides things which are impossible from Earth, but at the same time has to be kept clean from debris, and we cannot mess up with space because eventually everybody loses. So this is a strength and weakness of space which make it so precious and so potentially useful for peaceful international collaboration.
And many say that the era of space economy has already come. Do you agree with that? How is that technology integrating in people's lives nowadays?
Well, I don't think that anybody could really survive today in the modern world without space technology, and people don't realize it anymore. If they grab their phone, if they use navigation, if they switch on the TV and watch meteorological forecast. So space is an integral part of society today and of our daily life, and I don't think we could do without. And I think what we are doing here with this live transmission is one of the best examples.
Oh, that's right. That's exactly right. Now, final remarks from both of you. What were your expectation for this conference this year? What was the most exciting thing that you will be looking out for?
I was expecting a great conference, well organized, because I know China is very effective in that, and I found it. But I found a spirit which is very forward-looking to the future, with a new way of collaboration in mind. And I think governance of global collaboration and cooperation is the issue on ways to allow all the countries which are spacefaring and capability of making space instrumentation and payload to work together, giving a role to them and dignity to all of them, both the largest one and the small one.
And Mr. Falketinger?
We remember very well still the International Astronautical Congress, which we have hosted together with the Chinese Society of Astronautics here in Beijing in 2013. And already at that time, we've seen how China is opening up for cooperation with international partners. And if you ask about my expectations, we've seen my expectations already fully fulfilled today by China reconfirming the readiness to cooperate with the worldwide space community, and I think the world community is very pleased about this development and will take that up very positively. And if we can contribute to this development with the Congress, with the conference here, and with the activities of the International Astronautical Federation, we'll be very happy.
All right, many thanks for sharing your insights with us, and thanks for taking the time to talking with us.
Thank you to you.
Thank you.
Now, 2017 will be a remarkable year in China's space exploration, with some 30 space launches planned, including the Tianzhou-1 cargo spacecraft launch, as well as the Chang'e-5 lunar probe. China's sharing its progress with every country that wants to get involved. The only stumbling block comes from the U.S. government's Wall of Amendment, introduced 2 years ago, prohibiting government-to-government cooperation between China and the U.S. on space exploration. Yet space really is the last frontier for mankind. And hopefully this is something America will soon come to understand. Let's hope space is something that can unite mankind together into a common destiny. Welcome back to The Point. A number of Arab countries led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have cut ties with Qatar for accusations of terrorism. They are retaliating with a variety of steps, including the halting of land, air, and sea traffic, rejecting its diplomats, and ordering Qatari citizens to leave their borders within 14 days. Qatar, meanwhile, has called for diplomatic talks and end the crisis. Why are they cutting ties with Qatar, and what will be the likely impact on Qatar and the region? I'm now joined from the UK by Professor Anuj Atashami from the School of Government and International Affairs at the Durham University, and also in Washington, D.C. by Mr. Reza Marashi. He's the Research Director at the National Iranian-American Council. Many thanks to you both for joining us. Now let me start with Professor Atashami first. The rift between Qatar and countries led by Saudi Arabia is described by some media as the worst rift to lift the Gulf since the formation of the Gulf Cooperation Council in 1981. What is the immediate fallout from this ban, and how could it develop?
I think it is true this is the biggest rift that the GCC has faced since its foundation. While there have been ripples in Qatar's relations with Bahrain, with the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, it has never really got this bad, through which Qatar is squeezed on all fronts, it seems, for its domestic and foreign policies. It is being pressed to basically surrender what is essentially a rather independent foreign policy, and be asked to fall into line with this emerging agenda of Saudi-led counterterrorism, to line up against Iran, but also to limit Qatar's autonomy in terms of its actions in the region. Where this can go, of course, is anybody's guess. As you know, today the Kuwaiti Emir, yesterday the Omani leadership were trying to intervene to try and bridge the gap between the two parties. And Qatar at the moment is holding its powder precisely because it is hoping that this issue can be resolved peacefully, quickly and diplomatically. And in the meanwhile, though, as you've seen, President Trump has tweeted saying that fingers were pointing to Qatar when the question of terrorism had come up in Riyadh just recently. And so we don't quite know exactly how this one is going to be resolved. But the impact you already see in Doha in terms of food, in terms of access to water, and reports that some people are beginning to withdraw their hard currency out of the country. Highly damaging developments in terms of Qatar's national economy.
And Professor Atashami, you earlier said the current flare-up in tensions is just a slow-burning fuse that has been burning for a long time in the background. So talk to us about the backdrop of all this. I mean, what are the reasons that they're not mentioning?
You're right. This has been a slow-burning fuse. It started, I suspect, when the current Emir Tamim's father took control of the reins of power in Qatar way back in 1995, when he unseated his own father while he was abroad on a trip. And after 1995, Sheikh Hamad began to chart a new path for Qatar, the first element of which was distance between itself and Saudi Arabia, that it wanted to come out of the shadow of Saudi Arabia. To do that, the Qataris needed to develop a whole new persona, and that was to redefine the relationship with the international community, to refocus their efforts on becoming a major LNG, the natural gas producer and exporter, but also to begin to draw Independent Arabia closer to the United States, which they've managed to do successfully. And the fourth leg of this strategy was to put in practice this policy of independent, autonomous relations with the neighborhood through the exercise of soft power. And that was Al Jazeera, with which I'm sure your viewers are very familiar, as it was then, a very independent, new, fresh perspective that provided insights right across the Arab world and also internationally on how the region saw itself and how interest in the region. Highly revolutionary steps as far as the region was concerned from 1995 onwards. In 2013, Sheikh Hamad, unprecedented in the region, decided to abdicate and pass the reins of power to his son, Sheikh Tamim, the current emir, without any interference. Young emir to begin to recast, if you like, Qatar's relations with the region. That happened, unfortunately, at the time that the Arab world was going through the combustions of revolution. The Arab Spring had already started in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia. Civil war was on the way in Syria and in Yemen. And that has made Qatar's relations with the region, but also this crafting of its independent foreign policy much, much harder to articulate. And it is bringing of these crises compounded by softening oil and gas prices, which is now leaving Qatar exposed. And all of this came to a head at the American Arab so-called Islamic Summit in Riyadh just last week, during which President Trump has now created what seems to be a coalition of Sunni Arab countries against radicalization, against terrorism, and ultimately also against Iran. Qatar finds itself really bereft of allies amongst that group, and also a challenge for its foreign policy to be able to maintain relations with Islamist groups. Many of them are peaceful, but it has had links with less peace-seeking states, but also to maintain these relations of independence of action in relation to foreign policy towards Iran, towards Turkey, and towards Israel. All of these are now being challenged by this coalition that the Saudis and the Americans have now put together.
So lots of revolutionary steps, and actually some of the traditional monarchies actually see Qatar as a threat for the position it's taken on modernization and the broadcasts even on Al Jazeera that you mentioned. Professor Atashami, Mr. Marashi, I'm afraid we have lost connection with him, so I'm going to stick with you on this one. So Qatar is accused of supporting terrorism, especially for its alleged support of the Muslim Brotherhood, a nearly 100-year-old Islamist group. But Qatar has rejected these allegations, calling these accusations unjustified and baseless. Is there any substance to this allegation?
To be perfectly frank with you, not really, because the Brotherhood, as you say, is one of the oldest political movements in the Muslim world, in the Middle East in particular. And between 2011 and 2013, was actually elected to power in Egypt. All right, it wasn't in the best government that Egypt had had, but nevertheless, it was elected to that position through the will of the people in Egypt. And it has a presence, substantial political, social presence in neighboring, in Jordan, in Palestine, in Tunisia, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, in Iraq, and elsewhere. You can't just wipe a movement of that kind of depth out on the pretext of that it's a terrorist organization because General Sisi of Egypt calls them terrorists, or because the Emiratis feel threatened by the Brotherhood's alleged emerging agenda. The Brotherhood has not used arms for its position since being removed of power in Egypt in 2013, and also its forces, the ones lined up in Qatar, are the core of the mainstream Brotherhood. Frankly, if it wasn't for Qatar to maintain dialogue with the Brotherhood would go underground and become much more of a militant organization than it is today.
And there's much contradiction in this. I mean, with regards to Iran, the alleged comment by Qatari Emir indicates he hailed Iran as an Islamic power and criticized Donald Trump and his policy on Tehran creating ripples in the Gulf countries. And these alleged comments came at a time when Saudi Arabia, with its Gulf powers, have joined forces with the U.S. to contain and counter Iran's regional influence. And ironically, there's a very large American airbase inside Qatar, which is used in the fight against Islamic fundamentalists in the region. So how do you see these contradictions playing out? What will the U.S. Pick a side? Will the U.S. be forced into relocating its airbase?
I would say, in fact, this is the worst case scenario if I was sitting in Washington, where there is me trying to put a coalition of powerful, wealthy, pro-Western Arab states together to confront Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, radicalism, Iran, whatever you want to line up against that coalition. And then you then begin to see at the very heart of this coalition a rift between two of its core members, both of which are actually close American allies. So for the US to have to choose a side is a real problem, because if, for example, it begins to move its airbase, the biggest in the Middle East, there are about 11,500 American personnel in Qatar right now. If they move El Udeid base from there to Emirates, for example, it would have major consequences for Qatari security and foreign policy. But also, through such an act, the US will be showing its hand in terms of picking and choosing alliances. That, in my view, will actually destroy the GCC as an organization that we talked about at the very beginning, because Qatar will find that it has no place in an organization which is diminishing its role as an equal member. So it puts the GCC at the crossfire, but it makes America's decision-making that bit harder, because it cannot, within this small coalition of Arab monarchies, pick and choose. It needs to keep these countries united, it needs to give them a common purpose, and it needs to make sure that they don't fight against each other for the greater purpose of fighting terrorism. And yet right now what we're seeing is this rift beginning to open up, and as President Trump has tweeted, that tweet is going to create new ripples of tension across the GCC countries.
And with all these developments, does it feel like Iran is enjoying this, diplomatic punch, if you will? Will this just push Qatar closer to Iran?
Isn't that irony of ironies, as you say? Barely a week ago, Iran had the finger of the Sunni world pointing at it for its regional behavior, for supporting Hezbollah, for opposing the peace process, for keeping the Bashar Assad in power, a whole range, for supporting the Houthis in Yemen and so on. And it felt really isolated, even though it has had one of its most successful presidential elections to date. Barely a few days before this summit was taking place. And the Arab world, for all intents and purposes, appeared united against Iranian hegemony, Iranian expansionism, and so on. And yet here we are, where Iranians are now announcing that if Saudi Arabia and the UAE block food exports to Qatar, Iran will get food supplies to them within 12 hours, that if airspace of Saudi Arabia is closed off to Qatar, Iran will open up its own airspace to Qatar, and that if Iran can do anything to enhance Qatar's security, is prepared to do it. And Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, has tweeted saying issues with our neighbors should be resolved through dialogue. It is supremely ironic that Iran is now counseling dialogue amongst the countries that should be united against it.
What do you think will be the ultimate result? I mean, Qatar is in a vulnerable position. I mean, the old land border it has is with Saudi Arabia. It is rich in oil and gas, yes, but it imports most of its food, so it's bound to be in a weak position. Do you think in the future coercion will work?
I think its vulnerabilities are even greater than that, of course, because Bahrain and UAE sit on either side of it, maritime as well, and if they're going to block off air and sea access to Qatar, then Qatar will have much harder work to do in terms of maintaining its global networks and so on. But, it's a month of Ramadan where Muslims are fasting, are with their families, and by and large, turning towards, if you like, more aspirational, extra-human issues. And Qataris will be feeling the unbrotherly, if you like, nature of this act, where at the height of Ramadan, to be threatened with deprivation of food and water and so on, will not sit well with the Qatari people. But they will in turn expect their own government not only to take a stance against Saudi Arabia and others, but also, more importantly even, to ensure stability and security of their populations. So Qatar will have very tough choices to make. I don't think Qatar can walk away from Saudi Arabia and Emirates and Bahrain, because ultimately these are its brother countries. It cannot form an alliance because that would push Qatar way, way out on a limb in a place that I don't think it is comfortable in being. So the best that Qatar can hope for is for the other members of the GCC, namely Kuwait and Oman, to try and bang heads and try and begin these warring parties together around a consensus. The consensus, though, is going to be very difficult to achieve because it's now public knowledge that Qatar has to sever links with Muslim Brotherhood, that Qatar has to limit all its support with various anti-Syrian government organizations, that it has to sever its links with Iran, and that it has to behave in a way that Saudi Arabia will regard as normal.
All right, thank you very much for your insights, Professor Al-Hashami, joining us
pleasure.
from Durham University in the UK. Now, here's the last point for tonight. After all that discussion, while the severing of ties was sudden, it has not come out of the blue. As tensions have been building for years, particularly in recent weeks, it has ignited the biggest diplomatic crisis in the Gulf since the 1991 war against Iraq. People know about Qatar, thanks in part to its national airline, Qatar Airways, its international news station, Al Jazeera, and through sport notably winning the right to host the 2022 Football World Cup. About 40% of Qatar's food is believed to come across the Saudi border, and a lengthy closure of the airbase and land borders would wreak havoc on the timeline and delivery of the World Cup. Well, more significant, though, would be if Egypt issue a similar ban. So around 180,000 Egyptians live in Qatar, with many involved in engineering, medicine, and law, as well as construction. A loss of that workforce would pose a huge problem for the country. And Saudi Arabia said it took the decision to cut diplomatic ties due to Qatar's embrace of various terrorist and sectarian groups aimed at destabilizing the region, including the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, and Islamic State group, and groups supported by Iran in the kingdom's restive eastern province. Egypt's foreign ministry has accused Qatar of taking an antagonist approach toward Cairo. And that is all the time we have for this edition of Point. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.